Hi, I'm Hans Pregler, Technical Director at Young Auditorium. Since we have no events until further notice, I have the opportunity to show you how all the magic happens behind the curtain. Welcome to Backstage Perspectives. Join me as we explore what it takes to put the show on the road. We will look at dance, music, theater, children's programming, Broadway musicals, and more. On this episode of Backstage Perspectives, I will be chatting with Mike Wood about the process of designing lights for a theatrical production and what has to take place before a lighting designer steps into the theater. Find a comfy seat, because our next episode starts right now.
So for me, most of that all starts back with the conversations with especially with the scenic designer, but mostly with the director. So a lot of times before I even do like any kind of research lighting wise, I'm talking to those directors and the scenic designers to see what kind of world they're creating first. I want to be a part of that process as early as possible, but a lot of the times in the places that I'm working and just kind of the necessity of budgets and everything else, sometimes I'm not brought into that process until later on. So for me, it starts off with that communication with the director, with the scenic designer, figure out what world we're trying to create. And then from there, a lot of it depends on the relationship I have with the director. If it's a new director, then I'll tend to do a little bit more research and I'll find imagery. I try to stay away from like production photos of anything because I don't want to give you like this is what it's going to look like. Instead, I try to do like inspirational images. And then it ranges to the other side of that. If it's a director I've worked with for years, then sometimes I don't really do any of that. We just talk about the project and then they trust me to implement what we talk about. I'd say, after those initial conversations that I have with the director, with the other designers, then I really start working with my team specifically. So I have a team of an associate designer / programmer that I work with a lot. His name is Dalton. He works with me on almost all my projects. And then I've got a couple of other associates and assistants that I bring on from show to show, depending on what the needs of that show are. So I work with those people and we talk about, balancing all the artistic side of it, but also dealing with all the logistical side of everything else as well. Because my team and I tend to work on a lot of projects at the same time. And so there's this whole logistical game of figuring out who's going to be where and who's going to be doing what when, so that we can best make sure we're meeting the needs of all of the various things we have going on. So once we kind of get all those logistic things figured out, then we can actually start creating some art, which is nice. I feel like the job is like 90% paperwork and logistics and 10% actually creating theater. So on a typical project, I usually get on site anywhere from a week to 2 weeks before opening night. Typically, the show has already been loaded in, so we've turned in a plot a month or two in advance, depending on the scale of the production. Then my team gets in. We usually get in the day of the designer run for the first time. So the designer runs where we're seeing the show for the first time, typically in a rehearsal hall. We'll usually do like a GoPro recording of that, so we can go back and watch it and figure out all of our cueing from there. A lot of theatrical designers will pre-plan all the cues in advance, know exactly where everything's going to go. I really don't until I see that designer run. I do a lot of musical theater, so I'm very familiar with the music, so I kind of know musically where everything is going to fit, but I don't necessarily plan all of that on paper until after that designer run. So I'll go through, as I'm sitting in the run, and I'll start marking things in the script as we're going through that run, and then over the next couple of days, we fine-tune it, we add numbers to it, et cetera, et cetera. So after that is done, typically then either myself or one of my assistants will go start focusing the show while I'll work on cue prep and getting everything ready and making sure that we're in a good place to actually start programming. Depending on where we're working, sometimes that we use a lot of previs technology. So we'll even in our theatrical work, we're using Capture to do as much prep work as we can. Even if we're not doing like a full programming of a show, we're doing presets, we're doing palettes, we're doing things like that. And then we finally get on site, and usually for a lot of the projects I do, I'm only in the theater, not on site. And typically for those, I'm only in the theater for a few days before opening. So we'll write as many cues as we can, and then we'll tech it with the actors, we'll tech it with the band, and we'll just kind of keep refining and working every moment possible until that show opens. Well, so this was actually right now supposed to be one of the busiest months I've ever had. From beginning of or mid-March through 2 weeks from now, we had 6 or 7 shows scheduled, major theatrical projects. So it was almost a show a week. And a couple of them were, they are all overlapping in some way. it was supposed to be an especially busy time, and they were scattered from some in Houston, some in Atlanta, some in Florida. 2 in Atlanta, 1 in Houston, 2 in Florida. So it was going to be a bunch of all around. And so the way we would handle that is the team would be like, okay, I'm going to leave after this first dress rehearsal, and then these 2 people are going to stay behind to make any last minute changes while I'm working with the other 2 members of the team. We're kind of leapfrogging back and forth on all these various projects. There are 5 main pieces of software that the team and I use to do all of our work. First one is Vectorworks. So we use Vectorworks for all of our drafting, all of our drawing is all done in Vectorworks. Usually we get a lot of the senior designers we work with work in SketchUp. So we use SketchUp a little bit, but it's mostly just to prepare to import into Vectorworks for what we need. We do Vectorworks for drafting. We use Lightwrite, and then we don't use Lightwrite like a lot of people use Lightwrite. So Lightwrite is, can do everything. It can do all kinds of pre-production paperwork. It can talk to EOS. It can do all of those things. I use Lightwrite more as kind of like a plugin for Vectorworks is the way I like to describe it. So I use it to edit a lot of my data at once because the communication works pretty well back and forth. And then I pull all that data once I'm ready to actually generate my plots into a program that I've made we call it the Paperwork Management Portal. And that was just because we decided we were going to come up with a name at some point. That was the placeholder name until we did. And now we have never actually came up with a real name for it. So that piece of software is actually based in FileMaker, which is a database tool. So it's all just based on relational databases. And the catalyst for that was I was sitting there one day. I was like, we're doing all of this data relates to one another. We've got follow spot cue sheets, we've got lighting cue sheets, we've got rig paperwork, we've got work notes, but it was all like on their own little island. It's like it would be way more powerful if all this stuff was in one place and could talk to one another. So we started kind of developing this probably in 2014 or so. We started with like an empty FileMaker database and we made a way to track work notes. And from there, it's kind of blossomed into everything. And I won't talk too much about it. There's a 2-hour live stream on my YouTube channel that kind of dives in depth about everything I did with it. And it's super simple. Once you learn the software, you can easily create your own tools to do the same things. It talks to the console, it does blah, 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 blah. So those are 3. I lied, there's 5, not 4. The 4th one would be Capture, then Capture the Previs program. So we don't do this on all of our theatrical shows. If it's a smaller show, there's not really a need for the previs. But on larger shows, especially with shows with a really tight timeline, we're finding ourselves using more and more and more previs to help save us time in the space. And the more moving lights we have, the more LEDs we have, the better we're able to use that technology to get a lot of that stuff done, like preset building and palette building, that would have normally taken a couple of hours in the theater. So now instead of our programmer having to sit there for 3 hours and do all the focus palettes and all these other things, they can do that all in their studio. And then when we come in, we just have to touch up a couple of things. Now that with Augmented coming to EOS 3.0 and everything else, we're excited for that because I think it's going to speed up that workflow even more. So it's that, and then of course the last thing we use is EOS. So most of the shows that I do, all of the shows I do in the theatrical world are based in the EOS family. You can see I have an MA behind me right now that Orwell let me borrow for the quarantine that I'm practicing on because I'm trying to brush up on those skills. So I use MA for other kinds of work, but all of my theater work is on EOS.
Thank you for watching today's episode. This program was made possible by Young Auditorium. We hope that you will support your local artists and local arts venues. If you would like to support Young Auditorium, please follow the link below. Also listed below are the links to the websites of today's guests. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share our content.